Okay. So hello everyone. I would like to begin by acknowledging that I am speaking today from the unceded land of the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation, and to pay my respects to their elders and families past and present. I would like to acknowledge too the ongoing existence of their laws. No pride in genocide. Thank you to everyone who has joined us today for this discussion panel, marking the 29th of November, the International Day of Solidarity with the Palestinian people. My name is Adil Hassan Khan, and I'm a senior research fellow at the Melbourne Law School. It is a real privilege and a source of enormous pleasure to chair this discussion panel on the topic of forms of solidarity, international law, and the question of Palestine. Hosted by and organized with the incredible support of this third worldist international legal scholarship oasis that is TWAILR now, and especially due to the efforts and support of Usha Natarajan and John Reynolds. Special thanks also to Haris Jamil, fellow TWAILR and colleague at the Melbourne Law School, and the Laureate Program on Global Corporations and International Law for making this event possible. John is one of our 5 incredible panelists we have joining us today. And apart from being a part of the TWAIL editorial collective, he's an associate professor at the School of Law and Criminology at Maynooth University, National University of Ireland. John has also authored several critical texts that have interrogated the topic of our discussion today, including a recent co-authored piece with Noura Arakat and Darrell Lee for Agile Unbound titled Race, Palestine, and International Law. He's also the author of Empire, Emergency, and International Law. Next, we have Ata Hindi, who is a Murphy visiting assistant professor of law at Tulane University and a PhD candidate at Tilburg Law School, and is the deputy editor of the Palestinian Yearbook of International Law. Apart from numerous pieces he has written on the topic of international law and the question of Palestine, his recent searing piece for TWAILR titled International Law is Dead is a must-read for all international lawyers, especially for TWAILers. Next, we're joined from a very early morning in New York City by Professor Vasuki Nesaya. Vasuki, who's been an untiring friend and a generous mentor for many of us, is a professor of human rights and international law at the Gallatin School, New York University. She is a founding member of Third World Approaches to International Law and has written widely, including on international law, human rights, and race, with a forthcoming monograph titled Reading the Ruins, Colonialism, Slavery, and International Law. Next, we are joined by Dr. Jordana Silverstein, who is also from NARM, Melbourne. Jordana is a historian and a senior research fellow at the Melbourne Law School and has been an untiring and fearless activist and organizer for Palestinian solidarity at local, state, and federal levels in Australia for the past several years. Her recent book, Cruel Care, A History of Children at Our Borders, draws attention to the entangled histories of different practices of racialized border making in the Australian settler colony. Finally, we have a soon-to-be Dr. Christopher Gievers, who is joining us from Durban, South Africa, where he's a lecturer in law at the University of KwaZulu-Natal. Apart from his prolific and profound scholarship on race, colonialism, and international and Pan-Africanism, I want to mention that Christopher is moderating a discussion tomorrow with international criminal law experts on South Africa, international law, and Palestine. His recent piece, titled South Africa, International Law and Stopping the Coming Tragedy, is a powerful call for third world states to take up their third world solidarity ethos in response to the persistent question of Palestine. So in terms of the format of this discussion panel, I will ask each of our panelists to respond to 2 broad sets of questions organized around our discussion theme. After the discussion amongst the panelists, we should have about at least 15 minutes for audience questions. Please use the chat function to share any questions that you might have, and I'll take those up. So starting the discussion off, if I may, with John. Can I ask you, John, to share with us some reflections on the forms of your Palestinian solidarity practices over the years, what forms they've assumed For instance, in terms of its languages, grounds, relations and communities and sites? And relatedly, what has the question of Palestine been for you in your solidarity practices?
Yeah, okay. Thanks, Adil, and thanks for those introductions and for organizing this. And I think obviously it's more important now than ever to be having these kind of gatherings. So yeah, I'm not quite sure how to approach the question or how to answer it. And I was hoping to hear from others first and maybe riff off them a little bit. So I just do want to put it on the record that Vasuki does owe me a drink for going first so she can finish her coffee. So yeah, I mean, I suppose there's a few different forms of solidarity practice and languages, as you'd say, that I'd maybe try and think this through in, or maybe just in terms of like wearing different hats that, you know, are ultimately all interconnected really. But like, I think firstly and at the most basic level, you know, to me, it's just about, you know, as a witness and as a person, really. I lived in Palestine for a few years in between doing my master's and my PhD. And so, you know, what I learned from people there, from being there, from seeing up close how the occupation works, how the apartheid regime functions in an everyday sense, that stuck with me. There's no way you can really unsee any of that or look away after that. And so, you know, at the most kind of basic level, it's just about really trying to bring that context and the insights that I learned from being there and from knowing people there and still being in touch with a lot of people there to any of the conversations that I'm having or the interventions that I'm making, whether that's in the university, in the media, at rallies and demonstrations, or just in conversations with groups that I'm involved in every day. And so maybe more concretely then, you know, some of the forms that's taken for me, you know, one is just as an organizer and as a coordinator, and so I'm involved with a few groups here in Ireland. One is Academics for Palestine, one is the Irish Anti-Apartheid Coalition for Palestine, one is the Ireland Palestine Solidarity Campaign. And so that's kind of involved in various campaigns and organizing coordination efforts ranging from growing the academic boycott here amongst scholars and academics here. It's at the kind of advocacy and policy level, trying to agitate for trade bans and sanctions through parliamentary votes and so on. It's organizing demos, and we've had, like many places around the world, we've had some of our biggest ever solidarity demonstrations on the streets of Dublin and other cities in Ireland the last few weeks. And then more specific things like trying to organize scholarships for Palestinian students. And so we've had, you know, one of the things, when one of the crumbs that the government kind of threw to us when they ultimately blocked a piece of legislation to ban imports of settlement goods a few years ago, even though it had a majority in the parliament. One of the things that we had been asking for and agitating for was for master's scholarships for Palestinian students to come and study here. And so that's been, you know, at least something concrete and enriching that we've had over the last few years. Another angle then is just as a teacher, I suppose. I don't teach a course specifically on Palestine, but I do try and make space for it in a non-prescriptive way, including materials about the Palestinian context or from Palestinian scholars and writers on Palestine, but also beyond Palestine, and thinking about Palestine as a global issue, not just a local issue. You know, what it means for us when we think about those broader questions of international law, of racism and imperialism, of borders, and anything else that I might be teaching on. And then also as a researcher, some of my research is quite focused on Palestine. I just try to just be as careful as possible to do that in a politically conscious way, in a non-extractive way, in a way that supports the best work that's been done by Palestinian scholars and anti-Zionist scholars generally. So part of that is to do with writing and publishing. And then I suppose as an international lawyer, not someone who's worked in practice or as a litigator as such, but I have worked a lot with Palestinian legal and human rights organizations. And I think they know better than anyone how complicit international law is in their oppression, but it is at the same time one tool that they have and that they don't feel they can give it up. And so, you know, I'm conscious of all of the pitfalls of being sucked into legalistic kind of debates, and conscious not placing too much faith on it or creating any false expectations. And I think now that ATA has kind of proclaimed international law dead and put the final nail in the coffin, maybe it will be easier to kind of focus on struggles elsewhere. But I think, you know, there are important things to be thinking about constantly, to be thinking through and revisiting about tactics and strategy, about how international law can best be deployed in support and in service of social movements and political movements. And I would just say it's also important to kind of remember that international law isn't a monolith. It is important to think about international law from below, international law in the everyday and in the local, not just in the kind of big high profile institutions. And so just because realistically the International Criminal Court is probably never going to issue an arrest warrant for Netanyahu or whoever, that doesn't mean that there aren't important legal struggles and legal cases being waged and being won in other forums. And then lastly, maybe just as an editor, and you mentioned the TWAILR review, and just to say that from the start, it has been important for all of us in the editorial collective to have a focus on Palestine, a space for Palestinian scholars if they want to write for us, and just we have, just as one small kind of gesture that we wanted to do for the Day of Solidarity today, we've published an ebook as part of the Publishers for Palestine project that many publishers around the world are involved in. I think it's around 300 publishers altogether who are making book titles freely available. And so we just put together basically a compilation of writings on Palestine that we published over the last 4 years since we set up the TWAILR review, including Ata's piece is in that as the most recent one. But you know, that is, I think as an editor, that has been important to me. And finally, as an Irish person, like, there is a particular character to Irish solidarity with Palestine because of the context of being a colonized country, but one that's very much within the European fold. It's not the same as what you have in the Arab countries or elsewhere in the global south, but it does have a different edge to it than what you would have in at least much of the rest of Western Europe. And there's various reasons for that, and I won't go into all that, and it's not to fetishize it either. You know, we ultimately do still have a centrist conservative government that rhetorically has been better than many other European governments in its statements and in calling for a ceasefire from early on, but concretely it hasn't done that much different and does tend to hide behind the EU. But there is something, I think, different in terms of the nature of popular solidarity in Ireland. There's something special about that. We had this massive gig for Gaza last night in the biggest concert arena in Dublin, and one of the bands involved, who's a kind of a folk hero band in Dublin over recent years, Lankin, they are just back from Germany. They had a big breakthrough album internationally this year. They were on a European tour. Their gigs got cancelled in Germany because they'd been saying controversial things like Free Palestine, and so, but they were part of this huge gig that we had last night, and it was a really emotional night, and you could see how much it meant to the artists involved, to us as a city and as a country. And I think they're the kind of moments to hold on to at these kind of times in terms of solidarity. And so yeah, I better stop talking there, but just to say thanks again, Adil, for bringing this together.
Thank you so much, John. I was wondering if Vasily had that coffee before and had gone, you'd come second. I wonder how much. Yeah, that was amazing. Thank you. So maybe why don't I ask Ata to sort of share your reflections on the same question, please.
If for any reason I seem choppy, I ask you to move to the next speaker, and then I'll try to connect from my phone and see if that helps out. But okay, so just let me know. Thank you for this wonderful opportunity to speak with you on what is, for me and my people, of course, a very important issue. it's there's a lot to unpack, and also I'd like to thank John for and the TWAILR team for the support that they've given myself as well as many other scholars, Palestinian and allies alike, and in creating a space for the types of discussions where we probably, could not be able to speak to the same things. Generally speaking, I like to, the world is full of injustice, and it's hard to keep up with the number of causes that exist all over the world. Palestine is of course, but one of them. It's but given the particular length in terms of how long the situation has been going on for Palestine, the Palestinian people, there's, it obviously is something that demands different types of solidarity, and it's ever changing in many ways, and it's something at least I would say, when I was younger and I was a student activist, you can see how much us being involved in so many different types of causes can really take its toll. So any sort of solidarity with the Palestinians is always very much appreciated, and of course we hope it's always not at the it's not at the expense of other causes that we should be given attention to as well. It's tough. It's tough to keep up with the injustice that exists in so many other places. I find, if I were to speak in terms of the scholarship and in terms of the practice, I'll touch upon a couple of things for a couple of minutes. I mean, we could go on and on about this particular topic, but if we look at the issue of scholarship, I think in particular, and we talk about international law scholarship, I think there are a couple of things that, at least for the past couple months, maybe over the past few years, especially as it concerns very specific area of Palestine, which is the Gaza Strip, is that we see that there is this, and I kind of touch upon this in my piece, is like, some people use their forums for good, some for evil, and some not at all. And in terms of the good, this could come in many ways, and sometimes it just means creating spaces for Palestinians and others interested in the Palestinian cause to be able to speak, to be able to write, to be able to discuss, to contribute to the academic discourse. And for many years, at least I would say, as a Palestinian, it was really difficult for me to be able to share my writing in particular on Palestine. I know if I were to try to submit the very unorthodox piece that I sent to TWAILR or anywhere else, it would have it would have probably been a little bit more difficult to publish. But these are and many times our raw sense of the state of at least international law terms, and how we see everything unfolding. And these different opportunities, you see it in various stages, and when it comes to the shaping of lawyers in particular, or legal academics in particular, a lot of times, these forms of solidarity can come through support for the Palestinian student who is struggling in Birzeit University, which I'm affiliated with, which I'm working with, and given these opportunities. John mentioned, for example, the issue of the scholarships. And in many ways, one of the difficulties I had was trying to get students to be able to have these types of opportunities abroad, because we don't really have anything like it within Palestine. Just people who are really interested, of course, with keeping in mind the flaws of international law, they're just really interested in contributing at least to this one part of the struggle, the legal dimension. And then, in terms of being able to contribute to the discourse, to the discussion, it's challenging, because the voices are, it reminds me of something that I've mentioned in another piece, very briefly. It's when, and I've heard this in variations, but one of them was very clear to me, and somebody saying, do you think you should be writing on Palestine as a Palestinian? Or issues related to Palestine, or that concern Palestine as a Palestinian issue. And I always say that, especially when it comes to international law, if you work as an international lawyer on Palestine, the Palestinians, you pretty much got to know almost every area of international law, as long as public international law is concerned. And I always found that that statement stuck with me for a while. Because I always found it fascinating how Americans can always speak to issues on the use of force for some reason without any accountability whatsoever, and I could give other examples, of course. And then we also have in terms of the practice, sometimes there's always this hope that there's the solidarity that really comes in the form of meaningful action. And what I mean by meaningful action is that, at least as it concerns international law, it means that states are doing things and not just saying things. Saying things sometimes is easy, but in many cases, you don't really see the doing part. And if you look at, for example, you see the kind of the divide that kind of exists today, and across practice and scholarship, we find that the world is kind of divided in terms of the global South versus the global North, and the way that solidarity is there or expressed. And it's almost like, at least for one part of the world, where it's almost a career killer to be able to speak to anything related to the Palestinians. It always has to be somehow balanced, or whatever it is, to try to find a way to say or do these things. And it's something that I hope will change after so many years in dealing with issues concerning Palestine and the Palestinians. But generally speaking, I think I would say that just a very, one kind of overall point is that the Palestinian cause invites all types of solidarity. And, that means everything from the grassroots level to the, individuals that are working as scholars or practitioners in international law. I think many of us know, as Noura Harakat has articulated probably the best from all of us, is that that international law alone is not, it might be a tool of emancipation, but it won't be the solution. And I think that it's not the only tool. So I think that everything from joining in, your local demonstrations, to writing on Palestine, reading on Palestine, is always important. And I know it doesn't kind of speak to the specifics of things that people can do, but you just try to find a way. At least I would say, as a Palestinian, when we felt that the issues of racial justice were finally being brought up here again in the U.S. For Black Lives Matter, was it was doing everything that we can to be involved on the street level and then to be writing on these topics. But yeah, I'll leave it at that. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Wasiki?
Great. Thanks, Ariel. And it's good that we started with John and Atta, because they gave such profound reflections about, and of course a history of practice that is sort of exemplary in many ways. I guess mine is sort of much more in some ways sort of my Regi Palestine started in a much more micro kind of sense, and perhaps this is similar to what John was saying, growing up in Ireland. I think growing up in Colombo in Sri Lanka as well, I and in a household that was very third worldist in its sense of what nationalism meant, that it wasn't Sri Lankan nationalism or Tamil nationalism, but a third world nationalism. I grew up thinking of Free Palestine and Free Nelson Mandela were sort of frequent things around the dinner table. But also in the newspapers, and I think in the sort of habitus in which I sort of came of age. So I think in that sense, these were the solidarities with Palestine was not seen as something which when I came to the US, of course, it was seen as something exceptional. In Sri Lanka, I didn't feel like it was exceptional. It was, in fact, what I remember what became exceptional was, when we grew up, there was no Israeli embassy in Sri Lanka. At some point during the war in Sri Lanka, Israel was providing military aid to the government, and then it started a consulate or some kind of outpost, as it did in many places, through the U.S. embassy, and that was an event. That was what was spectacular, and I remember many of us being shocked when that happened. So I think it was also about where I think location in some sense is quite important. And then I guess another dimension of the habitus, as I guess, is as a young college student, encountering and being interested in post-colonial studies, primarily through the encounter with Edward Said. So I read Orientalism in college 10 years after it was published, but it was transformative for me, as it was for a zillion other people at that and it continues to be transformative. But certainly that, I think, was so Orientalism was not about Palestine in particular, but it then opened up the world of Edward Said in some sense, to in ways that made were much more present because of a certain intellectual sympathy, in addition to a broader sort of political resonance. And then I guess then being I suppose the other sort of habitus factor is grad school and with TWAILRs. So the process of both starting TWAIL and studying international law amongst third world students, with the third worldism being the prism and filter through which international law was learned, studied, interrogated. That I guess was also, in some sense, I think, fundamental as a grounding anchor for thinking about Palestine. And then finally, I would suppose, I think, as an academic, now that I'm an old fat, as an academic, it's about, I think, using how one thinks of one's place in the academy in a whole range of different contexts. And certainly Palestine is critical in that on that score. So certainly in terms of BDS, both in terms of support for BDS, but also, of course, talking to everyone, in the US, in a context where, as Atta mentioned, people are losing jobs and so on. over the last 2 decades, it has been important to talk about BDS as an everyday thing, the way we may talk about our political affiliations for everything else. And so I think the interruption factor of BDS in the outside of Palestine is to normalize Palestine solidarity, is to make that seem not an exceptional thing, not something that requires extraordinary courage, but something that just requires regular human decency in some sense, even if that's a political way of framing, I think, what is a very political position. And in BDS, when I went to Palestine, I've been to Palestine only once, and it was in the context of BDS. It was actually with John and another TWAILR, Marcus Gonaflo, and at the initiation of yet another colleague, another TWAILR colleague who all of you may know, Nahid Samur, who convened, who brought us together in a panel that we did for a Walter Benjamin conference. It was in the Walter Benjamin conference was going to take place in Tel Aviv that year, and in violation, of course, of BDS. And so there was an alternative Benjamin conference, Benjamin in Ramallah, that was organized, and many of us attended it. It was organized not by law people, Sami Khatib, David Lloyd, and others who organized it, but we had a law panel within that, and of course, that just made many ties even closer. And also presented sort of new directions in which to both think through Palestine, but also, of course, act. And perhaps that's the other thing to say, that I think it's one of, like in every other context, I think for thinking and acting are deeply intertwined, and how we do scholarship and how we go to protests on the streets are both different sides of the same coin in some sense. And then perhaps the last thing to say was, just as a person in the university, in a very privileged university, a private university in New York, there are particular kinds of things that seem to have been that I'm able to do now, that because in some sense it is a place of privilege. So one is that we have started Faculty for Justice in Palestine, which is an organization that's now a network across the states. I don't know whether maybe it's global, I'm not sure. But there's always been a Students for Justice in Palestine, but we've now started a Faculty for Justice in Palestine, and I think since we started, there's been like literally over 100 others in different campuses across the US. So that's one thing, and that has been a forum through which we have been able to provide some support and cover for students and faculty who are much more vulnerable than us in terms of speaking about Palestine. So I feel I can speak, and have been speaking and teaching about Palestine quite freely, I guess, in a fairly uncensored way, always. But there are many others who are much more vulnerable because they're students, or because they don't have full-time positions, or a whole range of, or they're Palestinian, or they're Muslim, and therefore much vulnerable. So I think we are able to provide some cover on that score. I'm also involved with another group in the US. As you know, in the US, there's also been these attacks on critical race theory. So I'm involved in this group called Critical Legal Collective that has been trying to address some of the infringements on free speech around critical race theory. So that group has also now issued a statement on Palestine, and it's about thinking intersectionally and thinking solidarity in relation to the struggles around racial justice in the US and Palestine, thinking about freedom of Palestine as I said, also as a intellectual space, the intellectual struggle that we need to have in ways that are, I think, informed and inflected by critical race theory as well. Okay, let me stop there. I may come back to other stuff, but I look forward to hearing whatever else is. Thanks again, Adil, for convening us.
Thank you so much, Basaki. And yeah, the significance of thinking about the where and the when. And yeah, I'm thinking about settler colonial Australia, where a statement like ceasefire now is considered a very radical statement, and just so yeah. But also thinking about that, and what Atta was saying about other sort of tools, other than international. I wanted to ask Jody to sort of share her reflections.
Thanks, Adel and Harris for organizing this and for having me here. And yeah, I'm really grateful and feel a bit out of my depth, and apologies for being the non-lawyer here, as speaking as a historian. I apologize for that, and apologies also, my internet's not great, so I apologize if I cut out, just skip over me. But yeah, so I'm speaking to you from the lands of the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation, and I pay my respects to their elders, past and present. It always was and always will be Aboriginal land, and sovereignty has never and can never be ceded. That fact of speaking as a colonizer here is central to my myself and my work in solidarity with Palestine. What I've learned from First Nations peoples here and what I've learned from Palestinians is really, central to my academic work and central to my life. I'm a Jew, and I'm the descendant of Holocaust survivors. And those facts, of course, are also central to what bring me to this work that I've been doing for nearly 2 decades now. That similarly, I guess, it's coming to university and learning about settler colonialism here, learning and seeing the connections between these settler colonies, seeing the really, very clear ways in which they're interconnected in practice and in histories. So I guess, really thinking and taking seriously those questions of settler colonialism and how they play out is quite central, I think, to my solidarity work. And to the way, so I've been speaking a lot with particularly a Yamatji colleague and friend, Crystal McKinnon, a lot about our solidarity practices and the ways in which we have worked together for a very long time. I worked together with Palestinian colleagues, and particularly Mikhail Sahar, but many others. And that the sort of these conversations are really require all of us in a lot of ways, that when we're thinking from Australia, that the relationships between Aboriginal activists and Palestinian activists is really quite integral, and for those of us who are from neither of those groups, learning from that relationship has been really instructive about what solidarity looks like, and a real in-depth, strong, committed solidarity. So, my work is in Jewish history, it's in settler colonial history, it's in histories of Zionism, and in histories of Holocaust memory, as well as histories of Australia and immigration here. But it's also, my work is also very much, I guess what we could say, like on the street, or it's community engaged, or it's just what I do, really. And I've been involved in numerous Jewish groups. Currently, groups like Jews Against Fascism and the Loud Jew Collective. More recently, in the last couple of years, I'm involved on the board of a Palestinian-led organisation called APAN. And those things are all completely intertwined for me. My academic work isn't separate from this community work. But for me, it's always the question of what is my role as a white Ashkenazi Jew, as a former Zionist and now an anti-Zionist. And my anti-Zionism is, and it's broad and it's thoughtful. It's a diasporous position, so it comes from Jewish texts, as well as from a commitment to Palestinians. I'm anti-nationalist in general, so I'm opposed to all nation states and all state violence in all its forms. And so what is the role, right, of Jews in solidarity with Palestinians? And I think that's a really important question for me, and something that I hold always as a question, and always trying to act, I guess, as much with humility and trying to decenter myself and Jews more generally as much as possible. So stepping up where we're useful, and always when we're asked to. And of course, not waiting to be asked all the time, but also making sure not to take up too much space, and always learning and relearning where I am and where we can be useful is really important to me. Taking risks is really important to me. there's no question that this is that my work in solidarity with Palestinians has affected my employment. I don't have an ongoing job. It's unclear who would hire me at this point. And that's fine. And these are the risks that we want to take. And I guess I say it in order, I know that there's people here who will be making decisions about when to speak up. And I guess it's something we all do, is we're always making decisions about when to speak up, and the knowledge, it's always fine, I think, to risk your career, or the imaginary of a career. It's such a irrelevancy. And the point for me of working in a university is what I can do with it. What does it give me access to? What resources, what platforms, what abilities to speak and to support? So for me, supporting, I'm hopefully known as somebody who people can approach for support, and that's what's important to me. I've of course had complaints about my teaching when I've given lectures in history, and you wouldn't want to be teaching in a way that doesn't bring complaints when you're teaching on this subject matter, I think. So, and of course, I say that because I can wear those complaints of being anti-Semitic, and I know that that's not an accusation that can affect me. But I'm also aware of that's a particular position that I have, and that there is privilege or something for me in being able to do that. So I guess, also thinking, about these questions of how can we support BDS? And at the moment at the university, there's campaigns around particularly Lockheed Martin and other aspects of the military and their involvement in the university as well. And then also, we've got the problem that affects universities across the Western world, really, of the IHRA definition of anti-Semitism that my university has adopted, and which obviously by calling Israel a settler colony, I'm in breach of. And we're hearing stories of people preemptively, or I guess out of fear, not speaking up in these moments. And it's really important, I think, for that reason, to speak up as much as possible for those of us who are prepared to, and to try to get those challenges, and to try to hopefully get the IHRA definition removed from the university. I think, the last couple of things I would say is that, for me, being particularly attentive to what Tucken Yang called settler moves to innocence, to being particularly aware of those times when I might be trying to excuse myself or people, and to being attentive to when others might be doing that, and to avoiding that at all costs, to seeing complicity and seeing my responsibility at all times. And Melanie K. Kantrovitz has this lovely saying of solidarity is the political version of love. And to me, that's a really important idea, that our solidarity work is an expression of love. It's obviously not for me to say whether my solidarity is useful in any way. That's a question for Palestinians. But I think to me, it's this continual relearning practice of attempting to do my best and attempting to be helpful in as many ways as possible. I'll leave it at that.
Thank you so much, Jodie. And I can testify to the fact that you've been a sort of pillar and an inspiration for us in the law school here. Christopher.
Thanks, Otto, and thanks to everyone before. Like Jodie, I sort of feel a bit out of my depth. Unlike Jodie, I'm going to apologize because I am a lawyer. And I'm going to say a few things mostly about some of the more legal aspects of solidarity as expressed in South Africa over the last couple of years and over the last couple of months in particular. But I wanted to begin by acknowledging that location for all the reasons that Jodie's articulated, but also because I think solidarity in South Africa now is quite distinct from many other places where other people are expressing it. It's a really, really, I want to really stress that there is no there is no threat, there is no risk, and this is speaking exceptionally as a person with gainful employment, a white man at a university in South Africa. Obviously, a lot of what has been experienced by people just for speaking out is something that is not at all something I've experienced. I want to start with thinking about that location, and then also maybe end with saying that that location offers opportunities I want us to think through about what South-South solidarity might mean, precisely because there's freedoms being experienced, I think, in South Africa and across other parts of the global South to speak out that are already productive, and that we can think about how we harness those. So I guess I follow a similar path, I think, to many of the speakers before. So my solidarity is part practice, part scholar, part public engagement. So I'll start with the lawyer part, because it's the part I'm least possibly ashamed of. But so for about a decade now, I've been involved in different things. I think the first bit of legal solidarity, if you can call it that, if that's a thing, in the context of Palestine, was an amicus brief to the Israeli Supreme Court about human rights obligations in occupied territories, I think in 2012. That was probably one of the only forms of solidarity or legal action that's involved, that's sort of taken place outside South Africa. Since then, there's been a lot of different actions, legal actions within South Africa. So civil actions, for example, trying to prevent and sue companies that support the building of the wall in occupied territories, criminal actions in terms of both prosecuting South African nationals who then are fighting in various incursions by the IDF, possibilities of prosecutions for war crimes under our universal jurisdiction provisions. In recent times, there's been a lot more advice sought and possibilities in terms of using our domestic law to try and engage the criminal responsibility of people fighting in Gaza and more generally in the occupation and the implementation of apartheid in South Africa. Most recently, in the form of sort of legal advice on questions of referrals to the ICC. So there's a strong legal dimension and a very localized dimension to the possibilities for solidarity as someone who at least who's not a practicing lawyer but has some experience with international law and still holds out a little bit of practice, a little bit of hopeful practice, although I can come back for that in a moment. So solidarity as a scholar, I think along the same lines as John, so as in teaching and in research. So not just centering Palestine and in writing about things like the International Criminal Court, but also solidarity in the form of op-eds, trying to public engagement. Also, Aldo mentioned the op-ed, sort of South African specific interventions, right? So trying to create space for what seems like solidaristic practices and politics in South Africa to have a legal foundation. So to create cover, to try to do public engagement and radio interviews, these types of things around the legal dimensions, so that the government can pursue what seems to be a progressive line in respect to Palestine without having the kind of backlash it might otherwise have. So public engagement, webinars. Aldo has mentioned the webinar that's taking place, I think, tomorrow with John Dugard and Navi Pillay. We're fortunate at our university, we have a Navi Pillay research group. So Navi Pillay is an alumni of our university. And so through that, we're engaged with the work of Navi, and both generally, but in specific relation to the Commission of Inquiry. So, and then I guess in publishing and trying to think through in a very sort of careful way, the framing of apartheid in South Africa and what that might do for how we understand both the question of Palestine in the immediate, but also the question of Palestinian freedom. So the forms of unfreedom that emerged in South Africa at the formal end of apartheid, and how these might resonate or jar with the projects of freedom in Palestine. So to think with Palestinian scholars, other international lawyers who are thinking through questions of race and colonialism, and trying to use South Africa not just as a historical example, but as an analog for both, not just for forms of solidarity, but also for the sort of the limits of the freedom that emerges, that might emerge at the end of a formal project of apartheid. So those are kind of the forms, I guess, of solidarity practices. The things that I think I wanted to say. So the one is that if I think about it in time, that the movement was from solidarity as a lawyer to solidarity as a scholar. And that was in part because there was a sense that international law was not going to save us, for all the reasons that Atta so powerfully and lyrically illustrated. And then in the last few weeks, it's gone back to be solidarity as a lawyer, right? It's interview meetings with people about what can we do practically, how can we get a referral, how can we get various, how can we encourage our government to make certain diplomatic moves using international law, how might we bring a prosecution. So we've moved back, or at least in my solidarity practices have moved back towards the lawyer. And I think that's obviously driven by people with particular important projects and needs, and very much see my role as supporting people who want to do these things with our law that we have in South Africa, which is very expansive when it comes to questions of universal jurisdiction and so on, but also a little bit of hesitance about the return to law, and the sense of the longer term project of putting our faith in law to save us. So there's sort of a discomfort perhaps between moving back to forms of putting faith back in international law, knowing and in a sense thinking about how that might be dissonant from the writing that has been going on for the last while. And then at the opposite of that has been a sense of solidarity or possibility of hope, of thinking of South Africa and other global South countries that aren't experiencing the same kind of backlash that's been experienced in other parts of the world as venues for solidarity, not just examples of how governments might be different, but venues of solidarity for legal claims, if that's the route we choose, venues of solidarity for academic practices, for conferences. So to really think about ultimately, if these spaces that we inhabit, that we invest so much effort in, can be closed down to us on short notice, if our jobs are so precarious, then what is the long-term audience for our solidarity? How might we engage the places and spaces in the global South that are more open, both to our scholarly practices, to our academic communities, and to our political and diplomatic efforts, right? So trying to think a bit more about not just local action, but linking up local actions across the global South, from questions of sanctions, from questions of legal interventions, but also the questions of scholarly practices, sharing ideas, information, sharing students to try to find those avenues, those spaces where we aren't facing the kind of resistance that so many people are facing in other parts of the world. So a sense of third worldist, revising the sort of third world academy in a sense, thinking of the spaces where we can think freely, and it's not just a struggle to get the first word out, and encouraging anyone who seeks those spaces to think of South Africa and other parts of the global South as a sanctuary and as places where you can come and, if nothing else, just give us some students to mark. I was saying to John before, we stand here ready to assist in whatever way it is, even if it means marking students or trying to assist. So thanks, Otto, for everything.
Thank you so much, Christopher. And I like the move from dead to undead international law. I am noticing the time. We have about 4 minutes, but I thought it sort of, if there are any quick reflections or any reflections that you wanted to come back to on other things, but I was wanting to put the question of what, with what Laura Erkat has called the continuing Nakba, its intensification in the past 2.5 months, what, if anything, have you learned or unlearned in terms of your practice of solidarity? What's worked, what's not worked? So any reflections on that sort of question? Any of you want to take that? Maybe Vasaki, since you had some remaining thoughts.
Yeah, I mean, maybe the one thing I would say I've thought over the last 2 months is that in addition to sort of the critique of Israel and of the US in terms of its support for Israel and for the genocide, there's and the critique of Europe is in addition to its support of Israel, it also has a particularly pernicious thing. It feels to me that they have, the responsibility for the Holocaust has somehow been shifted onto brown bodies, and there's a way in which the constant critique of Palestine and Palestinians is an evasion of Europe's own responsibility for anti-Semitism. And then, and now, of course, you cannot separate, I think, liberal Europe from the conditions that have produced people like the election of TWAILR in the Netherlands. That these are all deeply intertwined. And I think one of the things it is occurring in the last couple of months, maybe I was there earlier, but I've felt with renewed strength, I suppose, the last 2 months, that the racism of Europe that's embedded in European politics needs to be held to account as part of and the Palestine solidarity is sort of one way in which that manifests. So,
thank you so much. Anyone else? Especially in terms of like things, maybe if we could end on, reflections of hope and things that you were surprised by that have worked out. I mean, we know the spaces that have closed, but some spaces that have opened up in this period.
Yeah, well, I think one thing, I mean, I'd agree with what Vasuki says there, and I think, we have to come back to, the Césaire's idea of Europe being indefensible and really confront that. It is a very particular moment in confronting those civilizational discourses in Europe, and I think what is very clear is that, both from the liberal centrist point of view as well as the kind of neo-fascist far right point of view, is that there is this view now of Israel and of Zion, of the idea of white Zionism as this template for the ethno-state, and so much of it is wrapped up in migration politics and border paranoia and stuff that's been unfolding in Europe over the last number of years. And I think that is crucial. But I think, thinking about it from the other side, and in response to your question, Adil, I mean, I think, in one sense, what's happened in the last couple of months is nothing has changed, but also everything has changed in the sense that the core contestations are still the same, but the scale and the intensity of everything are magnified by many degrees. And, I think, and I'm curious to hear what others think about this, but I think, it feels like that there is a coming together of a kind of mass global movement around Palestine at the moment in a way that on a scale that we haven't had before. And so if we think about, some of the stuff that's been going on at the ports and the calls for disarming of Israel, the workers' movements and the unions blocking arms shipments, some of the direct actions against arms manufacturers and all that kind of stuff that's been going on, that we've had in pockets here or there in recent iterations. And there was this, big groundswell in 2021 in the context of Sheikh Jarrah and the Unity Intifada at that point. But and that was a lot of that propelled very much by the energy of the racial justice uprisings around the world and so on the year before. But there's been a strong counter-revolutionary move against that locally on the ground in Palestine, and also in terms of the repression of solidarity stuff globally. But I think, some of the kind of mobilizations that are going on now are beyond, if we think about Israel as a kind of a locus of regional imperialism, it feels like, what to me anyway, what's happening is going beyond just Palestine itself. And there's a lot of discussions about, now about the centrality of Palestine to the climate justice movement globally, for example, and a kind of a broad internationalist front coming together, in the name of Palestinian liberation, but which is bringing together, workers' movements around economic justice, ecological movements and environmental justice, broader anti-imperialist and anti-racist movements and racial justice. And some of the organizing that's going on is possibly opening up to, a broader kind of potentially transformational moment globally. And we've always had that idea to a certain extent of Palestine as a litmus test or as a compass, and that's been there. But I think, sometimes movements, are forged in the conjuncture and the crucible of struggle, and it feels like maybe this is, has the potential to open up beyond just Palestinian liberation itself. But I would be curious to hear what others think about that.
Yeah, anyone else? Yeah, Chris.
Yeah, so I agree. I mean, I agree with John and Vasuki. This is sort of international Trump moment, like where the quiet part gets said out loud, and it's very clear the civilizational discourse that's always been slightly beneath the surface. I think as a moment of hope, I think young people aren't buying it, right? I think for at least for young people, both on university campuses, which is why I think people are so terrified of what to do about universities and young people, is because they're not buying that anymore. It's no longer a question of why should I care? It's what is to be done, and I think that's a shift. So I think the shift, a generational shift in a sense, not just in university spaces, but diplomatically. So you see young diplomats revolting against their seniors, or you see movements of people at the UN who are refusing to be complacent in these, and I think that's generational as well. I think a sense, and certainly I think this is South Africa's understanding of this, is that a recognition that the solution won't come from the North, that at the very least the solution will have to come from the global South, at least in the interim, in the immediate. And I think it's an important lesson there because as a South African, I think the myth that we are fed is the idea that the international opposed apartheid, where it was the global South that opposed apartheid, and it was the global South that ended apartheid, and it was a global South that paid a high price for that solidarity, in particular African states, both directly and economically, for the solidarity with apartheid. So it's a moment to also think again about what it takes to end a system that the West wants to continue. And it takes solidarity, and it takes, it costs. And I think South Africa leading us, in a sense, South Africa paying for the kind of costs that were suffered by many other states of the global South for their support for the anti-apartheid struggle. So a sense that the geography of the solutions were never going to come from Europe, but I think there's a sense now institutionally there's a move to try to look for other spaces for those solutions wholly outside of Europe, either in a differently configured UN or somewhere else altogether. And I think that's taking us somewhere, as opposed to returning to Europe as a source of both the problems and the solution.
Thank you so much, Christopher. Atta, Jordi, any last words on this? Otherwise, we can start. There are a bunch of questions. I can pick those up.
Yeah, I don't need.
Okay, so okay, so I'll read these questions out. This one has been asked anonymously, and it's to the international lawyers. How can we say that international law provides emancipatory languages when we see the language of international law being used to normalize genocide, not only by Israel and United States, but by various countries supporting them? Do you think that terms such as belligerent equality and neutrality support the position of oppressors as opposed to those being oppressed? Anyone wants to take that? Maybe Chris as the mobilizer of international law.
It's a very strange position to find myself in. I mean, the short answer is that there's no emancipation in international law. Atta has made this very clear. But I think one thing I'd be interested in thinking about concretely is the difference between the mobilization of international law internationally and the strategic use of international law domestically. Right. So when international operates in a South African context, in order for a domestic court to do something like block a shipment, like arrest someone, like issue an arrest warrant, like force a government position, I think that is a strategic use of international law that has a different resonance from the invocation of international law at the United Nations. So I think it might be, and I think this is the paradox of TWAILR.
I think Chris's answer did not please the certain powers. Anyone else? Or we can come back to Chris, hopefully when he'll come back to us. I'll move on to the next question, if that's okay, because I'm mindful of the time and I know Vasuki has another appointment. So Vidya has asked, Atta has suggested supporting a free Palestine requires a different sort of solidarity. So this question is for all panelists. How is Palestinian solidarity different from other kinds of solidarity, even if the goals are interconnected? Anyone wants to take that? I think, yeah,
maybe. I mean, I don't know whether I don't know whether this is a larger theory about it being different, but I do think, and this maybe actually was implicit in what, or maybe explicit in what John said as well. It is a sort of a litmus test, or it is sort of it is sort of the canary in the coal mine. Ruthie Gilmore who analyzes the prison industrial complex in the US, says that when Black people are better off in the US, when they are free, when they can walk home at night at 2 a.m. and not worry about a police shooting, everyone in the US will be better. That there is a way in which, so I think with Palestine as well, it is like a similar test like that, or a similar portal, I suppose, into an alternative world, or our vision of it internationally. And so in that sense, I think it's different. And perhaps also just the sheer history of the struggle around Palestinian self-determination means that this particular, I mean, again, I'm going to just echo what John said. There's this moment of left internationalism. We haven't seen anything like it since the South African struggle. So I think that in that sense, also Palestine is, so this is not about the morality of one cause over another, and people are being fucked over all over the world, as Atta says, there's injustice everywhere. But there's particular particular constraints and opportunities that come with each of these struggles. And since Palestine is so embedded in the most powerful empire the world has seen, it has a particular portal into everything else as well.
Thank you so much, Vasuki. And I guess I'd add, speaking from South Asia, the importing of that, the settler colonial model and that ethno-nationalist model is the other thing that's also being globalized. That's something that, one has to be attentive to. Chris, you want to come back and complete your thoughts on international law? If not, I think Chris is still not here. So I'll ask another question I have, which is really, I think, for all of you. I have an inquiry for the panel. Beside monographs and literary studies that you've penned, and of course your co-hosts, is there any further recommended reading material or any that you can offer to the audience regarding some of these issues? So maybe some resource. I'd recommend the TWAILR website as one of the things, but is there anything else you guys would recommend for an audience who wants to do Palestine solidarity work?
Like there's so much, so it's hard to know where to start. But if we're thinking, like, just in terms of kind of some of the broad discourse stuff, Vasuki mentioned Edward Said, and I think some of the essays that Mohammed El-Kurd has been writing recently, he's been picking up on some of those themes that Said brought up about permission to narrate and Zionism from the perspective of its victims and so on, and taking on quite difficult and challenging issues, I suppose from writing from the Palestinian perspective, but speaking largely to a Western or US audience around some of the pitfalls and the problems of the politics of appeal and kind of the characterization of a certain type of ideal victimhood, or Palestinians being portrayed either as victims or terrorists, and challenging some of those tropes, and taking on, I think, some, he had a piece in Mondoweiss about, I think the title of it was about the settlers stole my house, it's not my fault they're Jewish, and taking on some of the those difficult questions around automatic kind of smearing and allegations of anti-Semitism. And so I think there's some really useful thinking in some of the stuff that he's been writing. There's so much else I can maybe try and think and put some stuff in the chat, but that would be one that just came to mind.
And I think I'd sort of plug again the sort of collective you've put together on international law in Palestine on TWAILR, and I'd sort of direct people to read that specifically, because that's a fantastic resource. I think Chris is back. He had load shedding. Chris? No. So I'm trying to sort of follow this stuff on the chat as well. Okay, I think Chris might not be able to hear us, but I just thought we've concluded right on time, and I wanted to thank everyone, especially our 5 panelists. If everyone can join me in sort of doing the Zoom clap. You guys are doing amazing work, and this was just fantastic. Thank you so much for your generosity and for your taking the time and the thought you put into this. We all really appreciate it, and I'll sort of, yeah. And yes, I wanted to plug, make sure before everyone leaves, there's in 2 hours after this, there is another fantastic Zoom virtual talk hosted by TWAILR as well, which Usha is moderating. Please join and register and join for that as well. We'll try and join from Australia as well. And thank you. I don't know whether I've forgotten something, but yeah, just thank you so much to everyone.
Thanks, Adil. Thanks everyone for coming.
Thanks so much, Adil.
Yeah, thanks, everyone.